Hello and welcome to Lecture 6 of ETH201, Corporate Social Responsibility and Business Ethics. This week we're going to turn our attention to international business and the moral and ethical issues related to how MNCs operate and the moral and ethical issues related to globalization. I really want to emphasize that these moral and ethical issues are an extension of the moral and ethical issues that we've talked about in corporate social responsibility and other topics earlier in the unit. And as well, I want to emphasize that one of the key differences between the way that organizations operate in domestic business, which is what we've talked about largely so far, and international business is the complexity of the environment in which they are operating in. If you're operating in an international business context, you have multiple legal systems, multiple economic systems, multiple political systems that you're engaged with in your host country, the different host countries you're operating in, and the home country that your MNC is based in. And you need to be able to manage, as a manager, what are sometimes conflicting demands and conflicting moral and ethical perspectives, conflicting legal requirements, conflicting political dynamics. So we're going to talk about all those things this week as we move through our key topics or our key objectives for this week, this module. In the tutorial next week, we've got some review questions, and our theory to practice exercise is going to be about the Bangladesh shipbreaking industry. There's a video case for you to watch, and then we're going to have a mini debate on that. I've also included several videos that provide cases and dilemmas being faced by international business about things like child labour, climate change, and some other areas. So that's indeed just to provide you with a broader background, a broader context of the issues facing international business. As with all of this unit, there are many moral perspectives that we can take, and we talked about 6 in this class as our model of the moral perspectives. And as managers, you need to look at the consequentialist and non-consequentialist approach to answering ethical dilemmas. So, what are our objectives and where do these slides come from? Once again, the slides are adapted from the instructor resources for the textbook, but I've extended those a little bit, and any other sources as indicated. So what are our 4 learning objectives for this week? Understand the nature and history of globalization. Explore moral issues relevant to globalization and its impact on power distribution around the world. Explain the operation of multinational corporations and understand the moral criticisms made of them. And identify legal and moral responsibilities of MNCs. That's a pretty big ask to deal with all of these things. In fact, there are courses I teach at other institutions where we spend almost half the course just talking about the nature and history of globalization. So, and in other topics you will have, I hope, touched on the concepts and the drivers of globalization. So I'm going to make a number of assumptions about what you already know to present this week's topic. And I'm also going to recognise, particularly when you get examined on this, that we're spending 1 week on the moral and ethical issues related to international business and globalisation. Just 1 week. So it's really quite a focused review of the areas that we're talking about. So, as I said, I'm assuming that everyone in the class has experienced some discussion of international business and globalization, either in other units that they have covered in their degree, or at high school, or at other courses, or just because you're members of society and you can see the issues that occur within the global economy, either in your working life or in your personal lives. Secondly, even though I've outlined 4 objectives that seem to be pretty separate, in reality they overlap. And that folds back into, I suppose, the statement that I made earlier that, in fact, I could spend an entire course just talking about Objective 1 or Objective 1 and 2. So they do integrate and overlap. And let me re-emphasize that many of the issues we're covering here are an extension of the discussion of CSR in domestic contexts. Domestic context, you have one legal system, one a political system, one economic system, and possibly one set of competing moral codes. So you may have competing moral codes, as we've talked about before. And in international business contexts, you're likely to be confronted with multiple economic systems, multiple legal systems, multiple political systems, and multiple moral codes. And the norms about how things occur in one country may be different to the norms about the way things occur in another country. So let's move on to Objective 1. In Objective 1, we're going to understand the nature and history of globalization. And I'm going to deal with the nature and history and globalization in just 5 or 10 minutes, which is, as I said, quite a brief coverage of those issues. But by the time we finish that, I will hope that you'll just have refreshed your minds on what you've heard of before through the other areas that I discussed or mentioned, your degree, your high school, as members of society. Have a clear idea of a simple definition that we're using, discuss the length of globalization, and talk about, well, basically one of the institutions of globalization, which is the World Trade Organization. So there are many ways to define globalization. Some ways or some definitions focus only on economic aspects of globalization. We're using a broader definition of globalization to include social, cultural, political, and economic aspects of an increasingly connected world. Now, what are the drivers? What creates that increasingly interconnected world? Well, I know under COVID-19, some of these are now more important than others are, purely because we don't have as much freedom of travel. But we do have a different perspective of distance and the time it takes to span the world. In the initial stages of international trade, well, not even in the initial, forever international trade has occurred. In the 1600s, the 1700s, it would take 6 to 10 weeks just to go from one continent to another continent. Almost 5 months to get from the UK to Australia by boat. With the advent of air travel, that became shorter, but it would still take 4 or 5 days to get from Australia to the UK. And in that process, that process was only reserved for the rich. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, with the arrival of the 747 and some other large Boeing and jets and some of its competitors, suddenly international travel became much cheaper. International air travel became much cheaper, became the domain of the middle class. I have older siblings of friends to go and do their gap year in the UK, which was quite common for Australians to do. They would have to go by boat, and it would take them 6 or 8 weeks to get to the UK, depending on the type of boat they travelled on. By the time I was looking at going on a gap year, so I'm a few years younger than the older brothers and sisters of my friends, and some of my friends actually did this, you could fly to the UK with 2 stops, one in Singapore, one in Dubai. You could fly to London in about a day and a quarter, about 30 hours, 32 hours. Now, it's reduced even a bit lower than that now. And the cost was around the same. It was around 750 Australian dollars at that time, both for the boat for 6 weeks or for the plane for 30 hours. And now it's quite common to travel by air everywhere. And with that advent of air travel, we've moved, and the improvement of shipping and interconnectedness, the concept of distance has become less. But that's not the only driver of the concept of distance becoming less. It's become much cheaper to shift things internationally, to shift products and services internationally. I had to order a new laptop yesterday. It actually came from Dell in Malaysia. The parts for that laptop came from multiple sources across Asia. It was assembled in Malaysia and sent to me. It was a customized laptop. It took 4 days to get to me. Now, it wasn't super customized, so they may well have just had it in stock and been charging me a little bit more for it. But it took 4 days from the time I ordered it to the time it arrived on my at my home. So global shipping has reduced distance, but there's other things that have reduced distance as well. During the period of European growth, sometimes called the period of European imperialism, you would have the British government, or any of the European governments. The British government used the British East Indies Company, for example, privatising their diplomacy and international trade. They would go and create colonial sites that would be run privately by the British East India Company. They would then trade. Those people would have incredible autonomy from the empire because the amount of time to get information back and forth would be weeks or months. When I first started studying and then teaching international business, that focus was on how people could communicate with expensive telephone calls or proprietary networks, because it was just at the advent of those things. Remember, YouTube and Skype are only 12 years old. The advent of those things, so to enable, so it's still quite costly to communicate internationally, and it would take 2-3 days to get from one place to another quite often. And you have issues related to time distance. Now, we just hop on a Zoom call or a WebEx call because of technology. The nature of the world has changed as well in terms of technology, not only in production technology and the pathways of production technology so that you source from multiple countries, but also the provision of services. I mean, Google's based in Ireland because of tax reasons, so it only pays tax in a low tax environment. But many companies, many tech companies, when you're buying something like an antivirus, a piece of software like an antivirus software, Digital River is one of the, which is a major provider of that type of service, is based in Ireland. You pay in Ireland, you don't pay any Australian tax. It comes back to you, the product arrives electronically, and you have it. The ability to create and then control machines and robotics by moving the information around electronically. The ability to have cross-border teams using technology. All changes the connectedness of the world. And that has led to an exposure, even though we have different cultures in different countries, we do have greater exposure to the culture of the other. And ideas have tended to become universal rather than localized. So these changes are all seen as dramatic. And part of those changes being seen as dramatic have been the things that have occurred since the late 1940s, after the Second World War. The advent of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, which administers the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, which existed before, the collapse of European communism and the evolution of much of Asian communism into a more market-based economy, or at least a more mixed-based economy, and changes in technology all drive these things. So we tend to perceive that this push to international business, to globalization, or at least to regionalization, is quite new. But in fact, there's always been global trade. There's always been these type of networks. We have ancient Rome, ancient Chinese empires, going back thousands of years. The Silk Road. European imperialism through the 1800s. Colonial powers, colonial networks that still influence the way business is done. The rising of, more recently, free trade areas, such as the European Union and the Australian Free Trade Area. And what was NAFTA, that's now with North American Free Trade Agreement, that's now the US, Canada, Mexico Agreement. So all those things have created global institutions that have changed the way that organisations, that governments operate. And on one side of the perspective of this, there is the belief that, well, what's happening here is that nations are losing their sovereignty. Nations are becoming less powerful as multinational corporations become more powerful. And the reason that nations are becoming less powerful is because some MNCs are larger than more economically powerful than nations, but also it's these supranational organisations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the European Union, NAFTA. These supranational, multinational, having many nations in them, are setting rules that governments have to comply with. And that weakens the nation state. And that is in part the catalyst of the UK exiting Brexit, as well as all those other race-based reasons that they've exited Brexit. Donald Trump's One America First policy is about trading on that belief that American citizens are losing sovereignty, and that and there's a whole pile of underlying race-related issues as well that contribute to this belief that the country is no longer controlled by the people in the country, it's controlled by others in the world. The counterpoint to that is that nation-states set their own laws, their own rules and regulations. They have the military. You can see some MNCs that seem to have military, but they have the military. They are the powerful group. They regulate business. Secondly, all these structural institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, NAFTA, the European Union, are made up of representatives of the countries that are part of that organisation. So it's hard to argue in reality that nation states have been overtaken by multinational corporations, that the true weight of power sits with MNCs. But MNCs do have a lot of power. In some respects, they can choose which country to operate in, to some extent. They can lobby and influence governments. They can behave in ways that lack transparency, that may be corrupt, to influence governments or influence members of governments to behave in a particular way. And I suppose we see that in the US at the moment with pressures for particular states to open early for economic reasons rather than follow what are pretty clear health reasons for staying closed, for sheltering at home, for sheltering in place. As an extension of that, we also see other things that are occurring related to a counterpoint, I suppose, not an extension. Just recently in Thailand, there's been quite a lot of coverage in the media about how they should open because it's the poor people that are being disadvantaged by this. Now, I'm not sure how many poor people have the ability to lobby and get extensive media coverage, so it's possibly the driving force of this is possibly the economic damage being caused to rich corporations and their owners. But that being said, the other alternative is, as the UK's done, as Australia's done, as much of Europe's done, as some countries in Asia have done, is to actually provide a basic wage, a basic subsidy. Now, Australia hasn't done it very well because I know many people in this room are temporary residents or under student visas. So therefore, you're not receiving a subsidy for your casual employment and you don't have options to seek job seeker. But they have effectively provided to an extensive part of the community a $1,500 shelf or an $1,100 shelf per fortnight to support society. In Europe, they've guaranteed, in the UK, they're effectively guaranteeing across the board 80% of the salaries. 80% of the salary. Now, that so the government could do that in Asia. Governments are not as, and therefore support that structure in the same way, and it would cost them less in reality because of the lower income structure of the countries. So you have those competing ideas. But there are competing forces within countries, and there are competing forces across countries about the interrelationship between business and government. And we talked about those things earlier. So I come down on the side that quite possibly the WTO and MNC, or supranational organisations like the WTO and the MNC, are not as powerful as and are not replacing the power of nation states to the extent that it's sometimes said. And if they were, the WTO would be in charge of the current pandemic, and it clearly isn't. So, when we look at the supranational organisation that most closely aligns with the world trade, with business, with multinational corporations, with business and globalisation, it is the World Trade Organisation. It's the global international organisation dealing with the rules of trade between nations. And at the heart of the WTO agreements are a series of negotiated, signed treaties, signed by the bulk of world trading nations and ratified by their parliaments. And the goal is to help producers of goods and services and exporters and importers conduct their business. Does it stop bilateral agreements and free trade areas and multilateral agreements between multiple countries? No, they just have to comply broadly with the rules. And the rules aren't able to be strongly enforced. The benefits of the WTO: it raises the general standard of living around the world by lifting people out of poverty. The speed it's lifted people out of poverty is not consistent, but there is evidence that it has. It enables the development of new industries within developing countries, though there are limits in particular industries that seem to come out of the power of lobby groups that exist within countries, both economically developing and developed, economically developed countries, for example in agriculture, that there are stronger barriers in those. However, the fact that there is a freer and more liberal trade environment has enabled developing countries such as Thailand, for example, to become newly emerging economic countries, in part because if you look at the way they've used their border investment within the WTO rules to create the Eastern Seaboard manufacturing hub in an undeveloped area of that country to become one of the major producers of vehicles in the world. The rise of China has largely been driven by their membership of the WTO and their ability to develop new industries. But of course, there's been clear government policies about improving infrastructure, training and development, liberalisation of the market economy that have in fact created within the Chinese political, legal and environment an environment that has enabled that to occur. And the other benefit is it makes goods and services available around the world to all people in the world. The criticisms of the WTO are that it's undemocratic, that it lacks transparency, that it's based on a capitalist ideology, and it benefits Western nations and multinational corporations at the expense of developing nations. Okay, so that's basically giving you the introduction to what we've been talking about and Objective 1. Take a break now, and then we'll come back in a moment in the next video to look at Objective 2, which is exploring issues relevant to globalization and its impact on power and distribution within the world. So in a way, I've introduced that by talking a bit about the WTO, but now we're going to talk about other things such as democracy, equality, homogenization of world culture, and distributive justice.